Welcome back to another video to our series, Lakeland, A Community Lost. This is Matt Carl from Leroy Heritage Museum, and today we're going to focus on the sawmill at Lakeland. Not only what was there, but also what remains there now, or the ruins of the sawmill. In order to understand what is there now, we have to understand what had been there before. And so in the introduction to this video, you saw how trees were cut down, the bark was peeled off in order to send to the tanneries, and then at that point the logs were loaded onto rail cars, and the logs then were brought to Laquin. Once they arrived at Laquin, they would be dumped into the log pond, and that is the footage that you just saw. Now, first of all, I want to explain that the video footage you're seeing of lumbering operations in this episode were not taken in Lakeland, but they were taken in a lumber town in Pennsylvania during the same time, and it is also a Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company operation. So, Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company, or CPL, took over at Lakeland after the Barclays were done, and the company operated very much the same way in these different places. So, although the video footage was not taken in Lakeland, you would have seen exactly the same thing going on in and around Lakeland at the time. All of the photographs, however, that are featured in this episode are all from Lakeland. So let's explain the process of how the logs got off the train into the log pond and into the mill. First of all, a log train pulls into town, and so the guys that you saw in the video footage have to release the chains, and they have to pry out those logs to just fall off the cars of their own free will. It's a very dangerous job. They certainly had to jump out of the way as soon as they could to keep from getting crushed by those large logs. Remember, a lot of these trees are virgin timber, and so they're very large trees, very large logs that they're bringing in. So it's a very dangerous job. But the logs will roll off the cars and roll down into the log pond. Now, once they're in the pond is doing a couple of different things for the logs. It's washing off the dirt and whatever it picked up from laying around in the woods and being laid on the rail cars. So any dirt, any dust, anything that might get into the sawmill and damage the blade, those things get washed off in the pond before going into the sawmill. It's also easier to move the logs to the sawmill. Prior to this time, sawmills tended to manhandle the logs into the mill without use of a pond like this. And so this was kind of a new innovation at the time, and it helped move the process along, make it a lot easier. A couple of men would be out on the pond, standing on the logs, which was also very dangerous, and would be moving the logs along toward the mill and toward the jack slip. And so some of the photos that you see from Lakeland here show the logs floating in the log pond. The log pond today is all covered in trees, so it's very hard to make out. But these photos show the log pond filled with logs. Now, the log pond at Lakeland was heated so that in the wintertime the pond would not freeze over. You'll see a pipe that goes into the center of the pond, and that is a steam pipe, so that's constantly pushing hot steam into the pond to keep it from freezing. In later years, after the sawmill shut down, the pond would freeze over because it was no longer being heated, and that is what caused the deaths of a couple of children who saw that the pond was frozen over, and they would cross the pond and break through the ice. Two children died in that way. One child fell through the ice, and the other tried to save them, and they fell through the ice and both drowned. And those children were coming home from school right on the other side of the pond, and they were crossing the pond to take a shortcut to get home that day, and they broke through the ice. Each year, the pond had to be cleaned out because the dirt and the bark and things would fall off the logs as they were put into the pond. This would accumulate at the bottom of the pond and would start to rot and would begin to fill up the pond. And so they had to clean that out. There was an area at the very end of the pond next to the mill where they could drain the pond, and then once they drained the pond, they could go in there and clean out what was on the bottom. People remember that it smelled bad usually because you have rotting wood and things, but that was a necessary part of maintaining the pond there. And when the pond was in operation, there was also a water line that came from the creek to continually supply water to it in order to keep it at the proper levels. So the location that the pond was at didn't necessarily hold water itself. It had to continually be fed water in order to keep it useful for a log pond. So what is there today in existence for the log pond? Well, you can see the outline of it, as you can see in these photos. The earthen bank around the edge of the pond that created it is still there. The pond doesn't hold water today. It was drained once the sawmill operation was over. And so one of the most important things that exists today as far as the log pond goes is right out in the pond you will find a concrete pier where the steam was fed into the pond. So in the sawmill photos where the pipe runs out into the pond, the end of it is sitting on this concrete piece and then providing the steam to the water from that point. So that gives you an idea of how deep the pond might be in that location. Now, we'll continue talking about the process of getting the logs into the mill in a minute, but next I want to talk about just an overall view of the mill. These are some pictures taken of the sawmill in the early days, and you can see the layout of the mill. The right side is where the logs would enter the mill and would go on to the log carriages and would go through and be cut. And then there are different sections to the mill, depending on what type of work was to be done, whether you were sawing the lumber or whether you needed to have planed lumber or you were creating lath. There are different sections for that. Now, there are kind of three levels to the mill, and there was what you might call a basement section, and then the main cutting floor was very high above the ground, at least 20 feet, because it was level with the lumber docks that were coming off the left end of the building. And then the top level was where the sharpening of the bandsaw blades took place, and you can see windows along the top of the building where that occurred. Underneath the building, you would find all sorts of equipment that was running in the mill. This was a steam-powered mill. This was essentially belt-driven equipment. It was run off from a steam engine, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. That ran through the wall from the powerhouse into the bottom portion of the sawmill, which turned a main shaft, and then other things were run off from that using belts that drove other equipment. All of that was going on underneath the main floor of the sawmill, and that is how the mill completely operated, and that's why the main cutting floor of the mill was so far above the ground. And as a result of that, you had to get the logs up quite a ways into the mill from the log pond. Now, another thing to observe is the smokestack that you see there at the mill. Now, some pictures have one smokestack, and you'll see later in the video other pictures have two smokestacks. That's because a second smokestack was added by CPL later on, but initially it had just one, and we will talk about the smokestacks a little bit later. But what is interesting to note is that this smokestack was being held in place with guy wires that were running down to the ground. And so you have to look closely at this picture, and I'll zoom in so that you can see. If you look very closely, there are 4 wires coming off about midway, and then there are 4 more wires coming off near the top as well. And so those have to anchor at some point. And so that brings us to the next ruin that is left of the sawmill, and that is the anchor points for the smokestack. These are some examples of those different anchor points. And these anchor points are concrete footings again, but in this case, they have a iron loop sticking out of the top that was probably forged by the blacksmith there in the car repair shop right next to the mill, I would assume. And so these are located in various directions from the smokestack. Some have 2, others have 1, and I would expect to see perhaps the ones with 2 have 2 different lines connected to them, and others had 1 which only had 1 line connected. There are some that actually still have pieces of the twisted wire cable still attached, so you can get an idea of what kind of wire was being used to hold the smokestack in place. The mill had 1 smokestack originally, which you can see in these pictures, and then you can see that the smokestack is coming out of not the mill itself, it's coming out of the powerhouse, which is where the boilers were, and we will talk about that later in the video. Again, as I mentioned before, a second smokestack was later added, and you can see that in this photo. This smokestack was added at the other end of the powerhouse, but still both smokestacks are coming out of the powerhouse building. So the next stop on the way to the logs becoming lumber is they had to be sent toward the mill, and they had to go up the jack slip. Now you can see in this photo of the side of the sawmill that the jack slip is what looks like a ramp in the center of the mill going up from the log pond up to the inside of the mill. And that is an endless chain with hooks, and as logs move their way toward the mill, they are caught by the hooks, pulled up the jack slip and into the mill. You can see in this video footage, again, of a mill that is not Lakeland, how the process works. These men move the logs toward the jack slip. When they get to the jack slip, they are caught up and brought up into the mill. Now these are some pictures of the inside of the Lakeland mill to give you an idea of what would happen once the logs got inside. Once they get up inside, the logs would go onto the carriage and would be placed in position there, and then this entire thing would roll back and forth on tracks through the mill and carry the log straight into the saw blade. And as it went through there, they could saw lumber off from the log in a very fast-paced environment. So there's a couple of guys standing there that are riding on this thing along with the log, and they're controlling the levers that make this thing move. Now that's a very skilled position because it didn't take much to move the levers. There are stories of guys that didn't know what they were doing that got on there and jerked the lever and threw themselves right off and caused damage to the mill itself. Of course, you could kill yourself on top of that. So this was a very dangerous position. But you can see that the log is being carried into the bandsaw blade, is being cut, and then the lumber is falling down onto a conveyor that carries it on through the mill. The bandsaw blades were 12 inches wide and approximately 80 feet long, extending through 2 floors of the building. The bandsaw blade has cutting teeth on both sides, and so as they go back and forth through the mill, they can be cutting lumber coming in both directions. Once the lumber went through the initial bandsaw in order to be cut into boards, it would also go through trimmers and edgers in order to get it to the size that it needed to be, and then the extra cut off parts of it that were not good enough would go into something called the hog that would grind it up into sawdust basically and send it on to the boilers. But other parts that were cut off could be used and sent out to the kindling wood mill, or it would be sent off to other places like paper mills that might use it as well. So let's look at some video footage of this process I've just described, taken at another mill in Pennsylvania at the time to show exactly how this process worked. So there were other pieces of equipment inside the mill that were used for other processes such as planing and so on. This is a picture actually taken inside the mill, and then of course the lumber was taken from there and stacked onto rolling carts to be taken out into the lumberyard. This is an example of many employees that it took to operate the sawmill. A number of these men worked out in the yard stacking lumber. About 30 to 40 men worked in the yard. Others worked inside the mill moving lumber onto carts. Others worked actually sawing the logs into lumber. Of course, some worked on the log pond. So there was a number of different jobs throughout the mill to keep this lumber operation running each day. Once the lumber emerged from the end of the mill, which you can see happening here, it was moved on cars that ran on tracks out onto these lumber docks that ran out through the end of the valley and provided places to stack lumber for drying. These are some images of that lumber dock. In 1910, it was estimated that the Laquin mill produced approximately 130,000 feet of lumber a day. In 1906, Lakeland sawed 33,419,000 feet of lumber, and only 8 sawmills in the entire nation did more than that at the time. So that gives you an idea of how large this Lakeland operation actually was. And again, some video footage showing at another sawmill how this operation worked. They're moving the finished lumber out to the location and stacking it where it needed to go. And once it had sat out in the yard for a specific period of time, it would be loaded then onto cars to be shipped. So here are some views of the lumberyard. It's just a vast place. These platforms go down in between the stacks of lumber, so you can see that there's plenty of places to stack lumber at. And these stacks of lumber are over 20 feet high because you can see they extend above the 20-foot high platforms. And so it's just amazing how much lumber that they were producing and drying and preparing for shipment. So I also mentioned the third floor of the mill where they sharpened the bandsaw blades and other blades necessary in the mill. And so you can see the third floor a little bit up close right here. These are some pictures I don't believe were taken in Lakeland. These were taken at a different location as I understand it. But this gives you an idea of what the saw sharpening level would look like in a mill like this. This was a place where the long blades were brought up and each tooth was sharpened, and the people that did this kind of work were paid a lot more money than most other of the workers in the sawmill because it was necessary to keep this mill running all day long in order to get out the vast amount of lumber that they needed. And so when the sawmill shut down for the second time in the mid-20s after CPL was done, this is a picture taken at that time of the sawmill and shows the log pond that has been drained. And in this picture, first of all, you can see the concrete pillar that the steam pipe rested on there to the right in the foreground of the photo. And then the rest of the parts that are wooden in the where the log pond would be are platforms that the men could walk on as they guided the logs toward the jack slip. And you can see that the lumber mill is boarded up. You can see that the smokestack has been taken down. Things have been taken out that had been there when the mill was in operation. Well, this gives you an idea of what is left there today, and it's not much compared to the size of the building that was located there. You see on the ground several concrete blocks, and these are poured footers that were underneath the mill on which either the structure of the mill sat or machinery underneath the mill floor sat. And so that is what you find for the main portion of the mill are concrete footings. The large ruins in the background we will talk about, that's part of the Powerhouse. We'll get to that in a minute. But you can see these footings are all over the place. Now sometimes people are surprised that concrete was used so much in the foundations of these mills and also the Barclay House and the churches and so on at Lakeland, because they were, I guess, surprised that concrete was used in the early 1900s. But in fact, concrete goes back even to the Romans. They were using concrete, and so it's been used throughout history. It was becoming probably more common maybe at this time in the building of these large structures. It was necessary to provide a good base to place the equipment that would go into the mills to operate them. So concrete was the perfect thing for this use. Now you can see a lot of the concrete concrete is in still pretty good condition today. There's deterioration that's gone on over the years, but considering that this concrete is over 100 years old, it has really survived the test of time quite well. And so we can see different sections of footers and differently sized footers depending on what sort of equipment was connected to it. Some still have bolts sticking out of it. It's hard to judge what each individual piece might have been used for because the mill was such a vast building. It's hard to know just exactly what each concrete piece was put in place for. But nevertheless, these are the only things that remain today for the sawmill. So behind the sawmill and just adjacent to it was the Powerhouse portion of the operation. The Powerhouse is a stone building that you can see in these photographs. The Powerhouse had the smokestacks coming out of it, and it was divided into two sections. You had the section of the Powerhouse where the steam engine was located, the coreless steam engine, which operated the mill, and then in the other part were the boilers where they were producing steam for this operation. So the smokestack comes out of the back portion of the Powerhouse because that is where the boilers were located. The door that you see going into the front of this building was going into the room where the coreless steam engine was located. And just adjacent to the Powerhouse was a small ironclad building that contained a dynamo, and that is the place where power was being generated also in order to provide electric lights for the mill and some major buildings in town and some street lights as well. And so that was being generated right at that location. You can also see that the pipe that provided steam to the pond is coming from the side of the Powerhouse there as well and running across into the pond. Now inside the first room inside the Powerhouse, this is what it looked like. This is the coreless steam engine. This is what Matthew Quinn saw at the World's Fair and liked it so much that he had it installed in several of his factories. Even though this mill was operated by the Barclays, Quinn was a partner, brought the coreless steam engine here to be used in this operation. So you can see in this picture that the coreless steam engine has a large wheel and a belt is running through the wall into the sawmill to run the equipment that is located underneath the sawmill floor. You can see electrical lines running through into the mill to run the operation as well. And you can see light bulbs hanging from the ceiling to light the inside of the Powerhouse. Just a lot of interesting things that you can see here. Pipes probably covered with asbestos are there. You can see that the roof is a metal roofing material. So it was basically a fireproof building. That's why it is a masonry building. It's a stone laid up building. And that is what the main portion of the Powerhouse was. We don't have a picture of the boiler side of the Powerhouse, but on the other side of the wall to the right is where the boilers were located, and that is where the sawdust was being dropped in and all worked together to provide power for the sawmill. And so if you notice that this steam engine sits on a concrete base, and then we'll look at that in a minute. So we have this interesting picture taken as the building was being torn down. You can see in the foreground that the sawmill has already been torn down. That's the rubble that you see in the foreground. But we have an opportunity here to see that there are two different rooms in the Powerhouse. Now we're looking from the opposite side of the building as all the other pictures were from, but you can see on the right side is the smaller room where the steam engine was located, and then the larger room in the back is where the boilers were located. Two things you can observe from this. First of all, on the left side, on the end of the building, the furthest away from the log pond, is the base of the smokestack. Now that was the original smokestack for this building. And then you can see sticking up out of the large room over in the right corner, you can see a masonry section sticking up out of there above the roof line. And that is the base of the second smokestack that was later added by CPL. So that is a fascinating picture showing just how that building was put together. It's important when you understand what's remaining of the Powerhouse to look at that piece that I mentioned that was the base of the smokestack that was added by CPL, that portion that's sticking up above the roof line, kind of in the middle of the building there. If you kind of keep your eye on that, next we'll look at what remains of the Powerhouse today. And so today, a lot of the powerhouse is gone, but there are some important sections that still remain. First of all, the part that is probably most visible to people is what I like to call the tower. It was not really intended to be a tower in its day. It just happens to be that this portion of masonry is all that's left. First of all, this is the base of the second smokestack added by CPL that I mentioned in the other picture. And you can see the brick portion. Part of it is sticking above the roof in that older picture where the powerhouse is being torn down. And you can see the iron supports that were bolted to keep that together, and you can see those in the older picture as well. This was apparently a concrete base that was poured after the fact, and then brick was built on top of that. I'm not sure whether the concrete is hollow or not, although there's a hole in the bottom of it suggesting that there might be some sort of a clean out area there. I'm not sure. But up inside of the brick portion, it is hollow, and you can see where probably the smoke was exhausted to, and then you can see that the inside of this was kind of built in such a way as to funnel the smoke up toward the smokestack. So it was a very interesting piece. Now it's sitting in the corner of the original portion of the boiler room, and the stone portion that sticks out on both sides of this concrete and brick tower, this would be the corner of the boiler room, at least what's existing. The portion that's facing the other direction toward the log pond would be the portion of the building where the coreless steam engine was located. So you don't see any sort of a floor, and you don't really see much of an outline of the powerhouse except for these major features. And I can only speculate why they did not bother to tear down that tower when they went to the effort to tear down all the other masonry and apparently cart it off and bury it. Perhaps they just didn't want to deal with this concrete portion, or perhaps they just had not finished this portion by the time that the CCC shut down, and the CCC did a lot of cleanup in the valley here as well. So why exactly that was not finished, I don't know, but it stood there for a number of years as a result of having been left. The other portion of Powerhouse that's left are the concrete foundations that the coreless steam engine sat on. Now you can imagine that the steam engine would have been very heavy, and it had to be bolted down. And so you can see on these footings that this is where the steam engine was bolted down. So you can see where the steam engine sat. You can kind of see a trench there in between the concrete where probably the large wheel and the belt ran on out of the building and through into the sawmill. And you can get an idea of how large these bolts are that held down this steam engine. So it's pretty amazing to think that right here where we're standing is the place where the power was created to operate the mill, and ultimately where the power was created for electricity for the town and so on. There are a few other random footers that would have been inside the powerhouse room originally for some other equipment that probably sat there. But if you take a close look at the stonework, this would have been an inside wall inside that first room where the steam engine was. So you can see the building is pretty incredible considering all of the stone is all different sizes. There's nothing uniform about this. And so it was a great deal of work to build this building. And the walls are quite thick in this building. I would say at least 1.5 feet thick, maybe even 2 feet in some places. But it was intended, I think, to prevent fire from spreading into the wooden part of the building, into the mill, which of course would have been a disaster if that were to occur. And so it had to be a fireproof type of a building in order to contain the boilers and the things that needed to be done in there. So this is the significant ruins that are left from the sawmill and the powerhouse and the log pond portion of the Laquin operation. So hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit more in-depth information about how this operated and what remains today. Now, this is hidden from view. It is actually on private property. Leroy Heritage Museum has done walking tours there, and that is how we were able to photograph these things. But it is on private property today, so we ask you to please respect property owners by not walking through the woods there at Lakeland without getting permission from someone. And we thank you for respecting people's property in that way. But we did want to share this history so you can understand exactly what was there and what remains remains there even to this day. So thank you for joining me again for this look into some Lakeland history, and next time we will continue looking in depth at another major building in Lakeland. For more in-depth information about Lakeland, you can check out our gift shop online at www.leroyheritage.org, where you can purchase the book Barkley Mountain, A History, or we also have images of southwestern Bradford County, ghost lumber towns of central Pennsylvania, and Romance of Old Barkley, which also has a little bit of Lakeland information in it as well, and those are available for purchase on there. If you go down and subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell so that you get notified about upcoming videos, we are planning to continue adding additional local history related videos to our site. We also do updates on our museum building project and other updates on museum events. So check that out. Also check out the previous videos that we have posted. We have around 30 videos on our channel already for you to take a look at. So thank you for stopping by, and see you next time.